Welcome back. All right, so it's a perfectly beautiful summer day out. And so what have I spent 2.5 hours, about 3 hours doing? Misery Index. Yep. So long break between the second video I did this morning and the third video I did this afternoon because in between I was trying to figure out Misery Index. Now, I've done Misery Index before where I've had regular season have somewhat of an influence. And the way that I got the formula to work this time out, I really diminished regular season. I may do a regular season one as well, but to me, the misery is really and truly and totally playoffs, right? You can have a great regular season, but if the team doesn't go anywhere in the playoffs, doesn't matter. So I gave no consideration for wins during the regular season, for division titles, for anything like that. And I went all the way back to 2006. So it's from 05, 06 until now. I did not weight things more in favor of, well, if they've won a cup in 2021, is that more important than a cup won in 2006? And the answer is no. I use the exact same numbers all the way across the board because things start to get really dodgy once you start talking about which ones are more important for misery. And this is just to measure the idea that, do you feel miserable about your team? Well, you might be right. And so if your team's in the top 8 here, you might be right. All right, that preamble aside, number 32 on the board, Pittsburgh. So Pittsburgh's number 32, which means that Pittsburgh is number 8 in their division. The Pittsburgh Penguins with 3 Stanley Cup wins over that period in time, a Stanley Cup Finals appearance as well, and very, very rarely missing the playoffs again since the 05-06 season. If anybody's wondering why I'm wearing Kansas City Scouts, it's because they had 2 years in the NHL. But there was some misery in those 2 years, and then they moved to Colorado as the Rockies. That misery continued, and then it would continue for a long time with New Jersey after that. I intend to do a misery index as well, where I look over like various decades and that kind of thing. So this is the start of some misery index videos for the summer. So yay! All right, number 31 on the board, Tampa Bay. So Tampa Bay with a couple of Stanley Cup wins. Tampa Bay then is 8th in the Atlantic. So this is a situation where you want your team to be down here. You don't want your team to be up here. That's a bad sign. But again, for Tampa Bay, back-to-back cup wins, Stanley Cup final the year after that. They've been in the finals outside of that too. So yeah, Tampa Bay ends up 31st on the misery index. So again, if you're a Bolts fan or a Pens fan, you're probably pretty happy about things, life in general, and just all that wonderful stuff that fans of other teams may not feel quite as happy about, like stupid butterflies. Anyways, number 30, Vegas, the Vegas Golden Knights. So, yeah, the Stanley Cup win definitely helps Vegas. They're 8th in the Pacific, obviously. And so what I like about this is it actually balanced out pretty nicely, where there was a team from each division that was 8th and at the bottom 4 here. So that made me happy. But yeah, Vegas with the Stanley Cup win they just had, it bumps them way down from where they would have been if not for that Stanley Cup win. And yeah, Vegas fans, I don't think there's any reason for misery for them either. So number 29, and also not quite as miserable as others, Chicago. For the Chicago Blackhawks, of course, there's been some lean years lately, right? So since 2018, it hasn't been a really pretty picture for Chicago, but they did have the 3 Stanley Cup wins, and they didn't miss the playoffs very often until we get to the 2021 and beyond portion of things. And so yeah, Chicago with the 3 Stanley Cup wins. Tampa Bay has 2 Stanley Cup wins in the salary cap era. Pittsburgh with 3, Vegas with just the 1, but they've only been in the league for 6 years. So see how nicely that works out? All right, good night, everybody. I'm kidding. So moving up to number 28, Boston. Boston won a Stanley Cup in 2011. Boston's also had some nice, long, deep runs in the playoffs, and so they're 7th in their division, and they're 28th overall. The Boston Bruins might be going through some stuff soon. Minus Bergeron, minus Krejci, there's the possibility that we go into some kind of a retool or minor rebuild, but yeah. Boston, number 28 on the board. Number 27, Seattle. Now, here's the reason for Seattle being so low. They've only been in the league 2 years. You're not going to have that much misery built up for 2 years, are you? So a Stanley Cup playoffs miss, and then an appearance that takes them to the second round. And so, yeah, Kraken fans, you can try. You can try to make the argument of, man, man, it's just, we've never won. What is with this? But you can't. You just can't. So yeah, the Seattle Kraken at some point in time could win themselves the Stanley Cup, but it's interesting that the two of the first 6 teams on the board are the 2 newest teams in the league, and it's legit. Like if Seattle had missed the playoffs both years, would that have bumped them up? Let me just double check here. So yes. Yes, technically it would have. Now, next on the board is also a team from the Pacific Division. So at 26th is Anaheim. So Anaheim won the Cup in 2007. They've also had some really good teams before the recent struggles for the Anaheim Ducks. The Ducks' struggles definitely will cause them to move up this board as the years go by. But again, just looking at playoff success or not success, they've had plenty of playoff success outside of the 2007 Stanley Cup win. At least enough to put them this low on the board. And so they've missed the playoffs recently. That could continue this coming season. But again, when we go from 05-06 until now, this is where they end up on the board overall. Number 25, also out of the Pacific Division. I was actually kind of surprised that the Pacific Division has 4 of the bottom 8. So the LA Kings, Stanley Cup wins in 2012 and 2014. So Cups, yep, a lot of Stanley Cup winners, and that's how this should work, right? So the LA Kings are at the top of this 4th column. These are your fan bases that are probably pretty happy with things, and I think it's kind of weird that 4 of them are in the Pacific when the Pacific is widely recognized as the weakest division, also home to the current Stanley Cup champions, so that makes it a little bit awkward. But anyways, yeah, they end up number 25, and so that rounds out the first column. So starting up the second column, we're going back to the Atlantic. And we've got the Detroit Red Wings, who of course won the Stanley Cup once in the salary cap era. Other cup wins prior to the cap era, but once the cap era came in 05-06, one Stanley Cup win. Of course, Detroit got older. They brought in some good players. Lidstrom stuck around forever. I'm surprised he's still not playing, to be honest. I think if he wanted to, he probably could. But you get Zetterberg, you get Datsuk as well, and of course Hasek, the very underrated Chris Osgood. But Detroit's also fallen on a lot of rough times over the last, 6-7 years, and so it moves Detroit up from where they would have been if not for recent seasons being as they are and everything. So number 23 on the board, I was kind of surprised, but this is how the formula worked it out. New York Rangers end up 23rd. The Rangers have had some good runs. And it feels like the New York Rangers, a lot of this is goaltending. So Henrik Lundqvist, very good in the playoffs. Now they've got Shesterkin, who also has been very good in the playoffs. And it leads to the Rangers making a finals appearance, conference finals a couple of times, which gives them points that are not misery points. So you have your misery points, and then you have the ones that detract and pull back from the misery points. And so the Rangers have been solid enough that they're 23rd. One thing I did not do for this misery index is get into how long it's been since teams won the Stanley Cup, because it feels like that does skew the numbers a little bit. And in this case, I just want to talk about from 05-06 until now. But yeah, the Rangers have not won a Stanley Cup since 94. But you can feel like they're close, that it could happen. Number 22, also, this team hasn't won a Stanley Cup in their history, and that's San Jose. So that is the 5th team in the Pacific. So is the Pacific a very fortunate division misery-wise? No, we've just got the 3 California teams on the board. So San Jose 22, LA 25, and Anaheim 26. If San Jose had won the Cup in 2016 when they got to the final, they would be lower on this board. But they did not. They were a finalist. Conference finals as well throughout this run. And we will talk a lot about teams that could have, maybe should have won Stanley Cup. San Jose will get mentioned in that. But yeah, San Jose ends up 22nd on this board. Number 21, and a cup winner as well, the Washington Capitals. They won the Cup in 2018. However, the reason that the Capitals end up where they are is because outside of that 2018 Stanley Cup win, there was virtually nothing that took away misery points from them. Virtually nothing. Second round, sure. First round, I guess. Playoff misses, sure. Conference finals, not really. So they had the 2018 Stanley Cup, which means that they end up 21st on this board. Otherwise, they would have easily been in the second column. The amount of points you get deducted for like misery points deducted for winning a Stanley Cup, because that's not misery. It definitely drops them down a lot further than they would have been. But that's their one Stanley Cup, and it's great. They won that, but it doesn't end up leaving them as far down on the misery index as one might think. Number 20, also a Cup winner, the St. Louis Blues. So for St. Louis, this is only the second team in the Central that's on the board. So if we really get into it, it seems like the Central's had its share of misery over the salary cap era. But yeah, and you'll also notice there's no Canadian teams that have shown up on the board yet either. So that will definitely be a talking point in this video. But at number 20, St. Louis, they win the Cup in 2019. But much like I said about the Capitals, outside of the 2019 Cup win, there really hasn't been a lot of joy in St. Louis when it comes to playoff time. So this is a team now that looks like they're in some kind of a retooling phase, and we'll see if they're able to win another Cup when they come out of that. Number 19 is the first Canadian team on the board, and it's the Canadiens. So Montreal Canadiens end up on the board there, which means that the Atlantic now has 4 teams on the board. Montreal has a Stanley Cup final appearance. They have conference finals appearances as well. And they've been pretty good. And obviously, Carey Price dragged them to some pretty good results in the playoffs over his time there. But for Montreal, a team that now appears to be in a rebuild of their own, the odds of them moving up this board as years go by is pretty high. But again, that's your first Canadian team, and that's at 19th. So we always talk about Canada and all this, but there you go. Number 18 is Dallas. So the Dallas Stars, they go all the way to the Stanley Cup final in 2020. They were conference finalists this year. They are 6th on the board when we're looking at the Central. So now we've got 3 from the Metro, 3 from the Central, 4 from the Atlantic, still 5 from the Pacific. So don't worry, though. The Pacific teams that are top 3, they are legitimate top 3. You will notice that they're the 3 Canadian teams. Spoiler alert. But yeah, Dallas, number 18. I had debated about whether or not to keep them at 18 because they were tied in points with the team that's 17th. But I feel like misery right now is going to be a little bit higher with Nashville. They missed the playoffs. Nashville's in a bit of a different place than Dallas, but if you want to say, well, that's a tie for 17th, then all right. But to me, I think Dallas belongs lower than Nashville on the board because Dallas made the playoffs this year. They go to the conference final. Nashville misses the playoffs. So I decided that was the only tie on the board as well. I decided with the tie for points, I thought, no, Dallas should be the one that's one step lower because of the fact that they lost misery points and Nashville gained misery points. So it feels like they're going in opposite directions, and Nashville seems to be kind of doubling down on that. So that's the lower half of the board. Again, if you're a fan of these teams, there's less misery. Since the invention of the salary cap in 2005, and again, that does encompass a lot of years. So yeah, there you go. Congratulations, your team's not as high in the misery index as what will follow. Number 16, going with the Metro Division team here, and that's the Philadelphia Flyers. So the Flyers start the second half of the board. The Flyers are interesting if you look back at 05-06 and in that about 5-10 year range there. When they make the playoffs, they go pretty far. And they did have a Stanley Cup final appearance in 2010. That was a while ago. But yes, they had a Stanley Cup final appearance then. They've been in conference finals as well. The Flyers going through some things right now, likely to move up this board as I do this in other seasons. But from a playoff perspective, they're 16th. They're right around middle of the board. Number 15, also around middle of the pack. A little bit surprising, but another Metro team. And that is the Carolina Hurricanes. So for the Canes make it now so that the Metro Division only has 3 teams left. The Canes at 15th. And honestly, if not for Rod Brindamore, if not for the moves made by Don Waddell, they'd be much, much higher on this list. Carolina was outside of the playoffs for a long time. It was 9 straight seasons they were outside the playoffs. So that definitely hurt them and definitely means they're higher up on the board than they otherwise would be. But those conference finals appearances helped. And so, yeah, Carolina ends up at 15th on the board. 14th surprised me. And yet, when I look over the numbers from 2005, 2006 until now, yeah, the Avalanche had a rough period there. They had a really, really tough time of it. So while the Avs have a Stanley Cup in 2022, and it's going to cause people to say, no, the Colorado Avalanche belong at the bottom. but this is from 05-06 until now. So if this was over just the last 10 years, then sure, Denver would be much closer to the bottom, but it's from 05-06 until now. And I intend to do other misery indexes during the offseason. And so, yeah, on this one, over the 18 seasons that we cover here, Colorado ends up right around middle of the pack. The Stanley Cup win absolutely helps. But again, if you look over their track record over the last 18 years, outside of that cup win, there's not a lot there. A lot of playoff misses, a lot of first round losses, and that adds up to some misery, although they're definitely not top 10 in misery. And again, recency bias being as it is, people are going to look at that and say, no, that doesn't belong there. But remember, in 05-06, Carolina wins the Stanley Cup as well. So I do not weight the Carolina Stanley Cup any different from the Colorado Stanley Cup in this one. Number 13, Calgary. So the second Canadian team gets on the board, and the Pacific now only has 2 teams left to go up there. The Calgary Flames miss the playoffs a lot. They don't get out of the first round often. And so for Calgary fans, if you feel like, it's probably been kind of a miserable time since the invention of the cap, you're not wrong. And so for Calgary, a team that's looking to, stop the bleeding when it comes to players leaving the team, they really need to establish some playoff success. You look at where players want to play: Pittsburgh, Tampa, Vegas, Chicago, Boston. There's a reason. It's not just the Stanley Cups either. It's that building success, the reputation. And so for teams that are on this part of the board, they have to build that reputation, right, as a winner. All right, so brings us to number 12. We have another Canadian team here, and that's the Ottawa Senators. So the Sens bring in another team from the Atlantic here. And yeah, for the Sens, it's been pretty slim pickings lately. They did go all the way to the final in 2007. They did have a conference finals appearance in 2017, but since then it has been a tough time for Ottawa fans. The Sens, there's reason to believe they could make the playoffs this year. Will they? No idea. They can. I hope they do. But again, last summer it looked like they might be a good bet to make it, and it just didn't work out. So Ottawa ends up 12th on the board overall. Number 11, Minnesota. This is where Minnesota fans get mad and say, no, your formula has to be wrong because we should be top 5. But believe me, the top 10, there's some misery here. So now we're down to just 2 from the Central. The top 10 is 2 from the Pacific, 2 from the Central, 3 from the Atlantic, and 3 from the Metro. So what's interesting is only 4 of the top 10 are from the West and 6 of the top 10 are from the East. And Minnesota is not a top 10 misery team. They're close. They're very, very close. Points-wise, this was close. But yeah, they end up 11th. For Minnesota, they've got to get things together. They've got Kaprizov. They've got a good young team. They do have the cap issue, but they've got to figure this out because who knows how much longer it's going to be with Kaprizov in his prime and having a really good team around him, and you've got to take advantage and get Minnesota off this part of the board. So remember, conference finals is where misery points get deducted. They haven't been in the conference finals at all during the salary cap era at all. Number 10, and would be much higher. The Vancouver Canucks would be much higher on this list if not for the Canucks that were able to get to the Stanley Cup final in 2011. They lost in 2011, but they got to the Stanley Cup final. If not for that, Vancouver would be much higher than 10th. They'd be in the top 5. But for Vancouver, it has been a miserable time lately. So again, if you're a Canucks fan and you're thinking, I feel kind of miserable, yep, the numbers would back that up. And Vancouver is outside of the Stanley Cup final run in 2011. Not really had a really solid, good memory in the playoffs. I know 2020 was fun, but that was the second round appearance. That's as far as that went. And then Vegas eventually overcame their own lack of goal scoring in that series and Demko and moved on to the conference final. So yeah, Vancouver top 10, probably to the surprise of nobody. Number 9 on the list is the New York Islanders. The Islanders have not made a Stanley Cup Finals appearance since the days of Al Arbor, since 1984. For the New York Islanders, what keeps them out of that first column is those conference finals appearances, because there's been plenty of playoff misses from 05-06 till now as well. So they're at the top of the second column. So again, if your team's not on the board yet, you might be thinking, yeah, that tracks. Or you might be thinking, why? Why is my team in the first column? And one team's fan base that may or may not agree with being in that first column, New Jersey. So the New Jersey Devils, number 8 on the board, and for New Jersey, they're number 2 in the Metro. Lot of time in between playoff appearances. They make the playoffs this year. They get out of the first round. That was really, really important. 2012, they were in the Stanley Cup final. But even with that final appearance and the points that get deducted for a final appearance, they're still in the first column. It's been a lot of years outside of the playoffs. So I've got my fingers crossed that the New Jersey Devils get things going their way this coming season and beyond, and win their first Stanley Cup since 2003. Definitely some long-suffering fans waiting for that. Number 7 on the board, Florida. Now, again, Florida had that appearance in the final this year. If not for that, they'd easily be top 5 on this board, but that definitely helps, drops them down a little bit. And it feels like for the Florida Panthers, a President's Trophy win last season, combined with the finals appearance this season, who knows? They may very well be on their way. The Florida Panthers have a good squad and should not be in the first column on this board for much longer. Number 6, and again, this definitely seems to track, doesn't it? Winnipeg. The Winnipeg Jets, they did have one run to the conference final. Outside of that, though, not a lot of happiness in the playoffs if you're the Winnipeg Jets or their fan base. This also includes the Atlanta Thrashers from 05-06 until the move to Winnipeg. And so it's been a rough go of it. Whether it's Atlanta or whether it's Winnipeg, it's been a really rough go of it. And, here's to hoping that changes. One thing that I pointed out to my wife, because I had to show Yvonne before filming this video, that she has teams 6 and 11 on the board. So, I've got 10, 18, and 28 on the board. She's got 6 and 11. So, I guess her misery index is a little bit higher than mine. Of course, she has to live with me, so sure. Number 5. Why would he say that? Number 5, Toronto Maple Leafs. So there you go. Toronto fans, if you're wondering how miserable are we, number 5. And here's what's great about this. So with this system set up, the bottom 4 teams all come up 32, 31, 30, 29. The top 4 teams, there's one from each division. Great. So Toronto barely, narrowly misses being in the top 4, but they were nowhere near tops in their division. So if you're a fan of the teams that are yet to be on the board, you know who's number 1 in each division. But we'll go over this in order. The Toronto Maple Leafs have not been out of the first round since 2004 until this season. But again, they haven't made the conference final in a very long time. And I think they need conference final or further, really. This is a Toronto team that desperately needs to win before they could potentially see Matthews, Nylander leave. Even if they just lost Nylander, if it's not a great return, like they're close, sure, but this shows you that in the postseason, because regular season has no effect on these misery index numbers. Their playoff numbers not great. So I'm going to do a misery index for the regular season too, and then we can compare and figure out which team has a really good regular season misery index and a poor playoff misery index, and vice versa. Then because I think that'd be an interesting way to looking at it. But for Toronto, there hasn't been any happiness in the playoffs outside of that first round win over Tampa, which then immediately got stomped out when they lost against Florida in the next round. Number 4 on the board, Edmonton. So the Oilers have had a good run regular season wise recently. However, a lot of years outside the playoffs from 05-06 until now. A lot of number 1 draft picks because they weren't in the playoffs and because they were just bad. I did weight the non-playoff appearances where if a team had a points percentage below 400 in a season, I gave them extra misery points for that. And so it definitely did change some of the numbers. And it brought some of the teams up that otherwise would have maybe been lower on that index. So the Oilers definitely have had some lean years. And there you go. The most misery in the Pacific belongs to the Oilers. And when you look at the Pacific, they've got teams 4, 10, 13, and then nothing until 22. So there's definitely a split between the Canadian teams, and then California has 4, 5, and 6, and the expansion teams have 7 and 8. So it's interesting how that works out. Number 3 is Columbus. Yes, the Columbus Blue Jackets, number 3 on the board. and number 1 in the Metro. So for Columbus, a team that's been outside of the first round once, they 2019, of course, got that huge upset win over Tampa, which is, it's 4 years later. It's kind of ancient history now. But yeah, Columbus number 1 there, number 3 overall. And so you've got 3, you've got 8 for New Jersey, 9 for the Islanders, and then down to 15 before you get to Columbus, right above 16 where you got Philadelphia. So the Metro Division, the misery is there, but it's a team in the Central and a team in the Atlantic battling it out for first on the misery index. Number 2 is Buffalo. Yeah, I'm kind of surprised by Buffalo being number 2 as well. For the Buffalo, I mean, I'm surprised they're not number 1. But for Buffalo, this really is it. Like, this is why you see empty seats so often in Buffalo. This is why fans are kind of fed up. This is why I'm rooting for Buffalo to make the playoffs. Look, I'm a Canucks fan. Canucks number 2 here, number 10 here. Misery, kind of my thing. This is an expansion that clearly has not gone particularly well for Buffalo or Vancouver. Buffalo had a couple of conference finals appearances early on in the salary cap era. Otherwise, they would be number 1. That's how close it was, the difference between number 2 and number 1 on the board. And number 1 is Arizona. So we talk about the Arizona Coyotes, and of course there's the arena talk and all of that fun stuff, which is not fun if you're a fan of the team or if you're running the team either. But the reality is that this is a team that has not had playoff success. Conference final appearance in 2012. Outside of that, it has been a wasteland. And it has really been a wasteland when you get to playoffs, outside of in 2020 when they did get that upset win to make the playoffs, where they knocked out the Nashville Predators, who are 5th in the Central there. So number 1 in the Central, number 1 overall is Arizona, number 6 is Winnipeg, number 11 Minnesota, and then you've got Colorado at number 14. In the Atlantic, you've got Buffalo at 2, Toronto at 5, Florida at 7, and that might be the most miserable of the divisions. But again, it all depends on your point of view. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Again, I don't show the formula in the videos because I know people would just say, oh, that formula, that's wrong. You should do this, and you should do this, and this, and this. But I looked at the results when I was done, and I was like, yeah, that works. That's sadly accurate. I think that's a pretty accurate reveal of how teams have done in the salary cap era. But let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through. You just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.